example.
Anastasia, and that's that bombing that they referred to.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so
I have a question, Rabbi.
yeah, yes.
I have a question. What is the Jewish halakha, obviously the Jewish halakha, on using a Bible to take an oath and adding "so help me God" for taking the name of God? We've
Oh,
fought that in the California courts for years, and they no longer do either.
Huh. So there's a whole lot. I can't answer your question directly, but there's a whole long issue with oaths, and for the most part, they're discouraged.
And they're canceled.
But you know, in Baba Metzia, there's a whole issue when you don't have evidence, but you about whether someone has mishandled somebody else's property, one can take an oath to claim that it was not mishandled. But taking an oath on a Bible to swear like this, I don't know. But I'd like to get started because there's an awful lot. First of all, there was a question left over from Barbara about was there really a Jesus? So not only did I do some research, but also Sarah Radcliffe did some research, and she sent me an email. And what I found was pretty similar to what she had, and I'm going to just share what she wrote to me. The bottom line seems to be that there are two close to contemporaneous non-Christian references from Tacitus and Josephus to someone with the name Yehoshua, who was at times viewed as the Messiah. On this and other bases, most scholars think that at least a minimal Jesus actually existed, meaning that there was such a person, but that very little else is reliably known about him. However, there are scholars who argue that even these sources are unreliable and that the figure of Jesus was entirely constructed by later writers. So it's a mixed bag, but it seems that most scholars claim that what I found was that there really was a Jesus. Even so, the events that are recorded in the Christian scripture cannot be corroborated by other sources.
Who was crucified?
It's very, very complicated. You know, the whole issue, all kinds of biblical. Was there an Exodus? Was there really a King David? All of those things are, you know, if you don't have either manuscript or some sort of archaeological evidence, how can you prove that things existed? So even there are two references in Josephus to Jesus, and one of them, at least, scholars think was doctored later on. Okay, so Barbara, I don't know, that's not a complete answer, but it's a part of an answer.
Thank you.
So let before we get to chapter 2 and chapter 3, let's review again just the most of the main points that we covered last week, and so because they're very important. Christians read the Old Testament through the lens of the New Testament. That's a very important point. You know, what does that mean? You know, if you watch a mystery, and you watch along the way, you know, and you're collecting different, but you don't know what the end is. If before the mystery begins, you know the ending. You know, you've read the book before you see the movie, and you see all the clues coming. You see the movie differently than if you didn't know the end. So when you say that Christians read the Old Testament through the lens of the New Testament, it is that everything in the Old Testament now comes to simply as proof of what is known to be true as claimed in the New Testament. So that's number one. Number two, Jewish biblical interpretation has no single point or goal. Christian interpretation sees Jesus as the main theme of the Old Testament. It's almost the same idea, but these are important things that before we begin. Showing how the Old Testament foreshadows the New is central to Christian interpretation. Christian doctrine, correct doctrine, is more important in Christianity than in Judaism. Orthodoxy, correct belief, is paramount in Christianity. So those are some of the important ideas that we talked about last time. And I repeat them because they will be themes all through the book. So chapter 2, Christian evangelists have told us that if we correctly understood the scriptures of Israel, we would see how they all point to Jesus. It's, this is again coming to the same conclusions, that the person beginning with the view that Jesus is the culmination of the scripture of Israel will find confirmation of that view. Christians take as prophecy passages where non-Jews or non-Christians see no prophecy. That's a very, very important idea, which we'll see right away when we get to the Gospel of John. A term that our authors don't use, but I use, is and a very important idea, both in Christianity and Judaism, is the idea of collapsed history. In a lecture that Priscilla urged me to see with Meir Soloveitchik, who is the grandnephew of famous Joseph Soloveitchik. In this week's lecture, which was Monday night, he told quickly a story about someone who asked his granduncle about what Maimonides had said centuries ago. And tongue-in-cheek, Joseph Soloveitchik said, "This is the first time in my life that I'm hearing that Maimonides is dead." I mean, understand what that's all about. I mean, certainly he knew that Maimonides was dead, but on a certain level, Maimonides continues to live. I experienced that directly with when I was in Israel, 1969, 1970. I went with two friends. We rented a car and we drove around Israel. We got to Miron, which is in northern Israel near Tzfat, and where the famous Rabbi Shimon ben Bar Yochai is buried. And we got out of the car, and it didn't mean anything to me. I mean, I heard the name Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, but I didn't know a lot. But Leon, our friend, all of a sudden was in a trance. Leon grew up in a very had very traditional education, a yeshiva education, and as this man who was there, who was explaining to us stories from the Talmud, all of a sudden Leon could actually, in his mind, see these people walking up and down the hill, walking in that area. For Leon, these were alive people. These were people who populated his life. They lived 2,000 years ago, but as he grew up, they were not historical characters. They were present characters. And I think that that's a very, one of the things that we see when you do Bible study with traditional commentary is that the prophets do not live centuries ago. The prophets live in our time. So you can take an idea from a prophet, and although that prophet said what the prophet said, they're almost all he, although we have Huldah and we have female prophets as well. But if the prophet may have said something affecting the life and times that the prophet lived in, but now it can be used by people later on to talk about the current situation. You may think that sounds absurd, and it sounds absurd only because Western education, the education that we've all had, is really based on understanding the evolution and development of history. So it's very important that we know, when people lived, what were the circumstances under which they lived, what were the pressures of their lives, what were the problems, and they are not necessarily the same issues that we're dealing with. But that's not the same for so there's, there's what a text meant and what a text means. So what a text meant in its time and what it means in any time. So any biblical text can be manipulated to prove any point, and any text, even one not recited by a prophet, can be taken as prophetic. Understand that. So you have a passage, and it can be taken to prophesy taken completely out of context. In chapter 3, she quotes something from Paul, where Paul takes a text completely out of context to use it to prove that Gentiles, in order to become part of this new Israel or early Christianity, do not need to circumcise themselves. We'll talk about that a little bit. So the predictive aspect is apparent only after the event is fulfilled. And she goes, they go along and talk about proof texting. Christians do proof texting, and we do proof texting. Anybody remember? She mentions anybody remember the book? There were a couple of them called the Bible Code. That was, I don't know, was it about 15, 20 years ago, where people claimed that if you took certain passages from the Bible and you read every 12th letter, and now you put those letters together, they predicted the the Holocaust.
Yes.
Or they predicted the 6-Day War. Yeah. Or they predicted, and people became crazy over these things. God predicted these things that are happening in our time. If only you uncover by reading, by reading certain letters and then putting them together. That is the worst use of proof texting that I can imagine. But proof texting is where recollection becomes prediction, so that things can be cited completely out of context. So the story of Israel becomes the story of Jesus. Here, we want to do. So do we do proof texting? In other words, take texts, and of course we do. Yep. And she gives us a couple of examples. How do we know that that in Jewish tradition we're supposed to do Birkat Hamazon? Because in a completely non-legal text, in a narrative text, the text says, V'achalta v'savata uveirachta. When you eat and are satisfied and bless. Oh, it says, so from that we derive halacha. We derive that when you eat, you should bless. Now, as a matter of fact, I'm reading, I'm going through Masechet Brachot, And I've just got to a section on Birkat Hamazon. And the issue is, now, you may be uncomfortable with this. Can a woman lead a group of men in Birkat Hamazon, or can woman lead a man in Birkat Hamazon? The issue, I don't want to spend time on this, but the issue is that saying Birkat Hamazon from the rabbi's point of view is a biblical commandment. For a woman to say Birkat Hamazon is only a rabbinic commandment. Therefore, a woman cannot say Birkat Hamazon lead Birkat Hamazon for a man. However, under what circumstances can a woman lead Birkat Hamazon for a man? If the meal that the man ate was so meager that he wasn't satisfied, then he's not biblically required to say Birkat Hamazon, only rabbinically required to say Birkat Hamazon. And there, under those circumstances, her requirement and his requirement are the same, and she can say Birkat Hamazon. You may not like any of that, but nevertheless. So here we take another example, of course, which we mentioned last week, is the whole very central piece of kashrut, which is separating milk and meat. And separating milk and meat is based on this verse that comes 3 times. And I think only once in the context of dietary laws, you may not seethe a kid in its mother's milk. From that, we develop separate dishes, separate towels, all kinds of separate things to separate milk and meat, and therefore we don't eat cheeseburgers because of this proof texting. Okay, I wanted to go to one other. So the last thing I wanted to talk about in chapter 2, she has a section that's called Polemics. I'll give you an example that she doesn't give, or they don't give in the book, of a polemic. You know that Rashi, living in the 11th century in northern France, becomes the most important medieval Jewish commentator on the Torah and on the Talmud. The first comment that Rashi makes on the very first word in the beginning, which is a bad translation of the first word, but he quotes a Rabbi Yitzchak. I always like that because it's Rabbi Isaak. He quotes Rabbi Yitzchak and he says, the Torah should have started from HaChodesh Hazeh. In other words, he'd say, this is not where the Torah should have started in Genesis. The Torah should have started HaChodesh Hazeh, which is the beginning of the 12th chapter of the second book of the book of Exodus. Why does he say that? He says that because his claim is that in the 12th chapter of the book of Exodus is the first time that we have a law. And his claim is there are no laws in Genesis, which is arguable, and there are no laws in the first 11 chapters of Exodus. So he says, so therefore, if your claim is the Torah is a book of laws, which is, by the way, how Torah has usually been translated by Christians as the word law for all kinds of reasons. He said, you're not understanding what the Torah is, because the Torah is not a book simply about laws. It starts with Genesis because, although it contains laws, it's the story of God's relationship to the world and in particular to the Jewish people. That to me is a polemic. And it's in many ways, I've always thought of it as an anti-Christian polemic.
Rabbi?
Yep.
I got a question.
Yep.
Are you differentiating between law and mitzvah?
No, I'm law being halacha.
Halacha, because if we take the first command of
Yep.
pru or vu, be
Yep.
fruitful and multiply, is that a law or a
Absolutely.
commandment?
And of course, you have the obligation one could claim that you have the obligation to observe Shabbat. So I say it's arguable whether the first commandment is in the 12th chapter of Exodus, but that's Rashi's claim. So that's a polemic. So with all that background, we now get to the text, chapter 3. So whether you have the book or you have the, as Phil said, he has the book online. Chapter 3 begins with the first 5 verses of the book of John. And so let me read it and follow along if you have it. It's in the book, it's page 69. In the beginning was the Word, Logos, and the Word was with God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him, not one thing came into being. What has come into being, in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. Well, obviously, this is John's midrash on the first chapter of Genesis. And because it's talking about, and in the beginning was the Word. I mean, how did God create? God created by, and God spoke, and there was light, right? So the issue of the Word is important, but in this case, and the Word was with God. In this case, the Word is Jesus. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him. Who's him? Right? And so as you read this text as a midrash on Genesis, the claim is that Jesus was with God at creation.
There's noise.
And also, what's the first thing that God creates? By God creates light. And the light here is also mentioned. So what has come into being, in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. So now we have the light now being, it's a metaphor for not simply light as opposed to darkness, but light as opposed to, it was the light of all people. It's sort of the source of life. It's the soul. It's, so this is, if you read John, there's no way to read John and not to read a sense of Jesus being already a part of the creation. The Word and lived among us.
Question on that.
Yep.
Does not fundamentalist Christian theology regard Jesus as God itself?
Here you have the Father and you have the Son. This is the Father and the Son.
Yes.
And now we go to the next, what's the next line? What's the next line in the Torah? The Ruach Elohim merachefet al panei tehom. And the Ruach of God hovers over the abyss. We'll look at some of the translations in a minute.
Yes.
So Ruach is a really fascinating word. And what I do is, does it, and the question that scholars ask, does it mean in this case wind or does it mean spirit? And I'm going to argue that it means both.
Mhm.
I want to use another word which linguists often look at. Look at the word cleave. What does the word cleave mean?
Cut in half.
Cleave means to cut. But at the end of chapter 2, it says, and so a woman cleaves to her husband. Does that mean cut him in half? So the word cleave is one of those interesting words that means it itself and its opposite. One word. And the only way you know what the word means
Context.
is from the context.
Context. Yeah.
But then you have words, I can't think of an example right now. You have words that have double meanings or have more than one meaning. And it really does mean both things at the same time. So, so the issue of, let me go back to, in 1917, the Jewish Publication Society published the very first translation of the Torah into English. It became the standard translation. Jewish Publication Society in 1917. In 1962, the Jewish Publication Society published a new translation. It's the translation that most of us that we use, and they fought, and so it was done by committee. And the committee had half rabbis and half Bible scholars. Some of those Bible scholars were also rabbis, and they fought over this word because the rabbis wanted the word spirit. The Spirit of God hovered over and the Bible scholars wanted the word wind. Which one won? Which one won? Well, I got our Chumash right here, and verse 2 says, "The earth being unformed and void, with darkness over the surface of the deep, and a wind from God sweeping over the water." So the Bible scholars won. Comment, here it says, a wind from God, or as others suggest, a mighty wind. The Hebrew word ruach means wind, breath, spirit. Wind was the prevalent understanding of the word here in ancient and medieval Jewish sources. As a physical phenomenon, wind conforms to the picture of primeval chaos evoked by this verse.
And this is from the 62.
Pardon me? That's the 62. That's our Chumash that we use in the synagogue.
There have been later translations, though.
They what?
There have been later
They
revisions.
use the later translation, which is the word wind.
Okay,
The 1917 translation uses the word spirit,
that came from the King James.
and probably came from the King James, but they did their own translation.
When Rabbi,
Yep.
when you look up the word spirit or spirituality in Hebrew, it comes from ruach. The word for spirit, there's really not a word, but they use ruchatit, I believe.
Ruchanit, yeah.
Yeah. So that, I mean,
It is the word for spirit, and not only spirit in an ethereal sense, but if you're in camp and you want the kids to sing out, you want them to sing out with real ruach,
Right.
right? That's the term that's used, real spirit. So we can use the word spirit. Here, the word spirit itself can have a very religious meaning. It can have a whole other kind of meaning of spirit. By the way, I'm always interested. How do we the translation of that first sentence is Breshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. With the classic translation is, "In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth." Right? That's not how how the
Ours is when.
translation translates it. The word shamayim in Hebrew does not really just mean heaven. It's simply the word for sky.
Right.
Right? So here you have the word shamayim, but if you translated that sentence, "In the beginning, God created the sky and the earth," yeah, it doesn't sound right. we want a more religious term. So we use the word, what in heaven's name is the heaven? Of course, if for Christians, it's got to be spirit, because it's the Holy Spirit is really what's being referred to.
It's only been recently that they say Holy Spirit. Traditionally, it was the Holy Ghost.
Well, right. But I think, but in this case, this is now in that beginning of John, that midrash, we have the Father, we have the Son, and we have the Holy Spirit, all of whom were at creation.
Yes.
Next issue that is raised, and she goes back and forth, is the issue of God being spoken of in the plural. People familiar with that? This is verse 1, chapter 1, verse 26, and we have in several places where it says, and God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. They shall rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the cattle, the whole earth, and all creeping things. Who is God talking to? Let us make man in our image. This is the sixth day of creation. So that's we go to the second story of creation in chapter 3, verse 22. Let me get to chapter 3, verse 22. And it says, and the Lord God said, now that the man has become like one of us, knowing good and bad, what if he should stretch out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever? Now that man has become like one of us, who is us? Who is God talking? Who is God conferring with? And finally, there we get to there's a couple of others. There is in chapter 11. Just giving you the evidence here. This is not a mistranslation. This is really what it says. Chapter 11. We have the story of this very strange story of the Tower of Babel. You may not think it's a strange story, but it is this very strange story. It's very short. Chapter 11, verse 7. So you remember the story of the Tower of Babel. And the Lord came down to look at the city and tower that man had built, and the Lord said, if as one people with one language for all, this is how they have begun to act, then nothing that they may propose to do will
to be out of their reach.
Will be out of their reach. Let us then go down and confound their speech there, so that they shall not understand one another's speech. Who's he talking to? Who's God conferring with? Well, it's obvious. God's talking to Jesus, right? Because Jesus is there at creation. It's a perfectly logical conclusion. So what do we do with that? Rather than giving you what our authors say, let me read you what it says in our Chumash, the one we use in Nevi Shalom. I should have brought the one that's used in Orthodox and one that's used in the Reform Synagogue, but chapter 1, verse 26. It says, "Let us make." This is, I told you there's the text and translation, and then there are two commentaries. So the above commentary says, "Let us make." The extraordinary use of the first person plural here evokes the image of a heavenly court in which God is surrounded by an angelic multitude. This is the Israelite version of the assemblies of pagan deities. This you would not find in an Orthodox text. This is the Israelite version of the assemblies of pagan deities prevalent in the mythologies of the ancient world. Wow. And now in the commentary, so there's a commentary above the line that I just read, and then there's a commentary below the line. So what does it say below the line? How has this been understood? Let us make man in our image. Commentators in every generation have puzzled over the plural language in this verse. Christians don't puzzle over it. It's obvious for a Christian interpretation. But it says, commentators in every generation have puzzled over the plural language. In Midrash, the Midrash envisions God consulting with the angels, perhaps hinting at a measure of divine ambivalence. Okay? In other words, there's a lot of Midrashim that say God wasn't sure whether to make human beings or not, and so he consults with the angels. Truth and peace oppose creating humans on the grounds that such creatures would surely be deceitful and contentious. Love and righteousness favor their creation. So there's a vote going on. For without humanity, how can there be love and righteousness in the world? God sides with those favoring creation. This is from the Midrash, from Breshit Rabbah. Or perhaps, same commentary goes on, or perhaps God was speaking to the animals. Who else is there, right? This is the sixth day of creation. Or perhaps God was speaking to the animals. Together, let us fashion a unique creature in our image, a creature like an animal in some ways, needing to eat, to sleep, to mate, and like God in some ways, capable of compassion, creativity, morality, and self-consciousness. Let the divine qualities manifest themselves in this culmination of the evolutionary process. Albo, a medieval commentator, Albo sees each animal species contributing their choicest quality to this new creature in Sefer HaIkarim. So this is an issue. We may say that who was there with God at creation? As far as we're concerned, God was there by, I can't say himself, herself, itself. But this issue of let us make man is something troubling to the rabbis as well. By the way, I have a commentary of Samson Raphael Hirsch. Samson Raphael Hirsch was a German, was the leader of the Orthodox Jewish community in Frankfurt in the 19th century. Goodness, I know it's right here. Yes. All right, well, the use of the pluralis majestatis, the royal we, employed by human sovereigns to proclaim their will to their subjects is probably intended to imply that that in issuing his orders, the sovereign is not acting from a standpoint of his personal will or his personal interests, but that he conceives of himself only in terms of his people and is issuing his instructions and dispositions solely for the welfare of the larger community. So Samson Raphael Hirsch talks about the royal we. One of the things that so important is this idea about Jesus being present at creation, that in one of the famous synods, our authors quote, those who reject it are to be excommunicated. That this is, this is a central theological, philosophical idea. And in other words, you cannot be a Christian from that synod if you don't buy it, if you don't accept it. And you have to understand that this is for a believer. This is so obvious that how could anybody reject this? How could anybody not see that Jesus is there? It's right there in First Genesis as interpreted by John, that Jesus is there with God at creation, and as the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. All of those things are there. She's in the book. They now go off a little bit to talk about the two separate creation stories. Right, we talked about that a little bit last week. People familiar with it? Chapter 1 through through the seventh day, which is Shabbat, which is I think chapter 2, verse 4, is one version of creation. And then chapter 2, verses 5 to verse 6, through the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, is a completely separate version of creation. Now, according to our tradition, who is the originator of, or where do these stories originate? They were written down by Moses at Mount Sinai. But Bible scholars will tell you that these stories were written, at least chapter 1 was written sometime after the temple was destroyed. So, I mean, a lot of this is speculation. How did these texts originally get written, and how were they eventually put together? Is a complicated issue. So most Bible scholars will say that that first chapter of Genesis does not come, since they assign it to the P document, the priestly document, that it's, so when are we talking about after the temple was destroyed? After 586 BCE. Let's get the numbers right. Supposedly, when was Moses? Moses about 3300 BCE. So we're talking about 586 BCE. Sometime after that, we're talking about not hundreds, thousands of years after Moses. Now we have to keep all of that she talks about the idea, or they talk about the idea, that actually one of the things you can do in English that you can't do in Hebrew is you can capitalize certain words. What happens all of a sudden when you take the word spirit and now you write it with a capital S?
It's a thing.
Huh?
It's a thing. It's tangible.
It's now divine. Now, what's interesting is that in German, all nouns are capitalized. All nouns are capitalized, that's standard. But in English, we capitalize only certain things. We capitalize first words of sentences. We capitalize proper nouns. We capitalize that which refers to God. Even so, when we refer to pagan gods, we don't capitalize the word gods. So it's a whole, and often when we get to references to God, and we use a pronoun like he, then even he gets capitalized in English tradition. So when you read the text and it has a capital S for spirit, it takes on a whole other meaning, simply by capitalizing it. All right. Um, so, okay, I've covered some of this. The word God in Hebrew, the word Elohim, which is not God's name, Yud He Vav He is God's name, proper name, but the word Elohim is the word for God. All of us that know Hebrew know that words that end in im are usually plural. But when Bereshit bara Elohim, we're using singular verbs, and there has to be in Hebrew has to be agreement between the subject and the verb, and we don't use a plural verb with God. We use a singular verb, but that can get somewhat confusing. You're all familiar with in the prayer in the service at the end of the second blessing after the Shema, before the Amidah, we quote from the Song of the Sea, "Mi kamocha ba'elim Adonai," which translates literally is, "Who is like you among the gods, Adonai?" Who are we talking about, gods? What kind of gods are we talking about? So, although she doesn't say it very, very clearly, there is a broad sense of belief that, in fact, the Torah that we're reading is not purely monotheistic. A monotheistic idea only evolves much later. The whole idea of God's incorporeality is, part of Maimonides' ideas. So, in fact, what do we do with that verse? I found it very interesting. I went to the prayer books we use in synagogue. So, the prayer book that we use on Saturday morning, on that verse, "Mi kamocha ba'elim Adonai," says, "Who is like you among the mighty?"
Mm-hmm.
Kind of cheating, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then "Mi kamocha ba'elim Adonai," who is like you among the mighty? Now, our daily prayer book does something even more outrageous. I looked at both of them. "Mi kamocha ba'elim Adonai," it says in our prayer book, "Who is like you, Adonai, among all that is worshipped?"
That's a later translation.
But that's not what it says. It's our midrash, our discomfort with what the literal text says. The literal text says, "Mi kamocha ba'elim Adonai." Who is like you, ba'elim, among the gods? It proposes a sense of, now, one could say that that's metaphor. They don't really mean it. It's part of a song. It's part of the Song of the Sea. It's one of the oldest texts in the Torah. It's not referring to other gods. Or you can say, yeah, it really is referring to other gods.
What I was trying to point out, though, Rabbi, is that the English in the daily Siddur is of a later generation, so to speak, than in the Shabbat Siddur. We haven't bought the latest version of the Shabbat Siddur yet.
Yeah, but both of them are cheating.
Oh, of course.
Right? Both of them
course.
are uncomfortable with the traditional translation, so with what the words literally mean, and so we translate it as we're comfortable with it. So when it says that human beings were created B'Tselem Elohim, in the image or likeness of God, What do we mean by that? What do we mean by that? Now we have mythologized that as well, but our scholars, Levine and Brettler, claim that really originally the idea was that we were created to look like God. What do you mean look like God? What does God look like? Well, we have actually passages in which people view God. One of the passages that she doesn't talk about is the 6th chapter of the book of Isaiah, where Isaiah, let me see if I can find it quickly. Isaiah is called to prophecy. Let me see, let me get this. It's a very dramatic section. In which in the year that King Uzziah died, I beheld my Lord seated on a high and lofty throne. He's talking about God, not the king. And the skirts of his robe filled the temple. Seraphs stood in attendance on him. Each of them had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, with 2 he covered his legs, and with 2 he would fly. You can look, this is the beginning, chapter 6 of the book of Isaiah. It looks pretty direct. And one would call to the other, this is the seraphs, one would call to the other, Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzvaot, Melochel Aretz Kvodo. Holy, 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 the Lord of hosts. His presence fills the earth. The doorposts would shake at the sound of the one who called, and the house kept filling with smoke. I cried, woe is me, I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. Yet my own eyes have beheld the King, Lord of hosts. So what did people believe at the time of Isaiah? Then one of the seraphs flew over to me, and with a live coal, C-O-A-L, which he had taken from the altar, and a pair of tongs, he touched it to my lips and declared, now that this has touched your lips, your guilt shall depart and your sin has been purged. Then I heard of the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send? Who shall go for us? And I said, here I am, send me. And he said, go, say to the people, and it continues on.
That's an echo of the Moses story.
This is what?
It's an echo of the Moses story.
Well, okay, it's right. We have several places where prophets are called to prophecy. So when we say that human beings were created b'tselem Elohim, our authors claim that originally, the original text meant that human beings were created to look like God, with God-like features. And it's only later that we interpret what does it mean in the image of God, in intellectual features, in moral features. By the Middle Ages, God was understood. We have an evolution. God is incorporeal and singular and depleted in all human form. So this is an evolution in Jewish thought, but now we have to read it back into the text. We read it back into the text. So we might claim, my goodness, what have Christians done to the text? We do the same thing. We have ideas, our ideas develop, our ideas evolve, and now we come to our new ideas and we read them back into the text. Okay.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
if I can suggest something, Phil, you might want to or Lee, I think you were on this morning too. When Mark, this morning in services, when Mark Sherman gave a devar, he was talking about the way that we were brought out of Egypt, and God had us going one way and then no, turn back and go another way. And he quoted from chapter 14. The Lord said to Moses, tell the Israelites to turn back and encamp before Pi Hachirot.
Yep.
Bein Migdal uvein Hayam lifnei Baal Tzafon v'nechnu tachanu al Hayam. And so they encamped there by the sea in an area that was known to have people there who worshiped many gods. That this was a portion, a way of going from many gods around, as they had been in Egypt, going through the sea to a purer place. Okay, so I'm wondering if that would relate at all to the Mechamocha verse by Ele Maranoi, because they've just been in a place where there were supposedly many gods.
In other words,
Okay.
you can almost impart using English grammar as a comment between Ba'elim and Adonai, who is like unto the gods,
Like you.
comma, Adonai.
Right. Who is like you, Baalim, among the gods? Adonai, Lord, comma, Lord.
Right,
Um,
exactly.
So my question is, how comfortable are you with the idea that the Torah is not monotheistic? That the Torah itself may have our roots, that we as a religion, as a people, have evolved in our ideas over the centuries, and we continue to evolve. That our ideas about revelation, our ideas about political ideas, that revelation somehow continues in our evolution. It's a dangerous idea because it means that we can go anywhere.
That's free will.
Well, it's not just free will; it's the will of the people. If we came from sort of polytheistic roots and we evolved from polytheistic roots, we could evolve into something completely different from where we are now.
And then we have humanistic Judaism.
So it's a
I don't see it as necessarily not monotheistic, because if we're always comparing God, our God, to all those other gods, like all those other people had gods, there were other gods, they don't count, like the idols and things that they tried to hide when they were leaving. I forget who hid the idols and got caught taking the statues. It's like
Rachel.
all of those, all of those other gods don't count. Yeah, there are a lot of other gods out there, but you're the God, you're the one God. And also, if he's saying he's talking to angels. Angels aren't gods. Angels are angels. And so there's still one God in charge of the hosts, one God in charge of all the angels. But I still don't see that there's more than one actual God.
There's a passage, I have to find the passage for you in Leviticus, I think, where God says to the Israelites, all those other gods are for everybody else, and they're not for you. It's sort of God acknowledging the existence and actually the power of those other gods. God doesn't say, those gods are for them, and it's all stupid. Don't. It's saying that's the gods for them.
But what about, wasn't there an original text of the Amida, that I know that we used, not the Amida, the Aleinu, where it talks about, because I used to say it when I was at B'nai Akiva camp, and they talk about, what is it, Chayil v'Reik or something like that, that all their gods are Reik. And we don't say it in our
That's right.
Aleinu, but the others do.
Hein mitachavim lereik ulehevel.
There you go. Hevel,
Yes.
Reik v'Hevel. So they're saying, in other words, that is proclaiming. I don't know how old the Aleinu prayer is, but that one is saying all their gods are Reik v'Hevel, and of course that's what we're saying. But so maybe anyway.
Okay, something to think about. We will. We have these important Christian ideas and how they evolve. What's interesting is that often we Jews have used the same methods, not usually for theological ideas, but we've used the same methods often for halachic ideas. And that's because our focus is really on behavior rather than on belief. Let me make one commercial before we leave today, and that is on Sunday. Sunday there is an event from our Israel 360 committee.
Yes.
It will be at 11 o'clock. It will be a focus on the life and times of King Herod, with a special feature that Rob Kahn, Judy and Gary Kahn's son, who is a rabbi and a licensed tour guide in Israel, is going to give both an introduction and some observations at the end. So that's going to be, but you have to sign up so that the synagogue will send you the Zoom link. I think it was announced in the email that came out yesterday. And I think it'd be interesting. I think that there's no more enigmatic and important individual. And what makes him important is, of course, what he's left behind. That anybody who goes to Israel is going to go to Masada, may go to Caesarea, may go in the West Bank to Herodium, and we'll certainly go to the Temple Mount, to the Western Wall, and maybe the Temple Mount, all of which were part of Herod's legacy that he left. But in fact, Herod was a lunatic madman. And he forms really a very important tradition between the Hasmoneans and Roman control over the area. So that's Sunday at 11 o'clock, and encourage you to. And so we will meet again next week. And next week our subject is Adam and Eve. This may have been a difficult chapter. I understand it as a difficult chapter. When I read it, I found chapter 4 easier going than chapter 3. So, but it's, what ideas come from the text and how have they been used. So to everyone, have a Shavua Tov, have a good week, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Go out and enjoy Tu B'Shvat.
Oh, today is Tu B'Shvat, that's right.
All day long.
All day long is Tu B'Shvat. Tu B'Shvat, the new year for trees, one of four Jewish New Years. My childhood recollection of Tu B'Shvat is that we had a cantor who was teaching us the song of Tu B'Shvat, which talks about Shkedim, Hashkedi Porachat, except he talked about almonds. We had no idea what almonds were. And we thought it was the funniest thing ever.
San Francisco, you didn't know what almonds were?
The Hebrew version, and then it's the English version of the same song. So today is Tu B'Shvat, originally a tax holiday, which you figured out what all of your produce was. That's why you did it when the trees were bare, and how much your tithes you had to pay. It has since gone to through all kinds of evolutions to become the holiday of the JNF, Jewish National Fund. If you ever bought a tree in Israel, you bought a tree for JNF. If you remember, you were given in Hebrew school those cardboard cards, and originally you put dimes in. The dimes got to be quarters, and you bought trees in Israel. Every time I've taken a group to Israel, one of the possibilities to do was, which I haven't done in a while, was to go and plant trees in Israel. And I always nixed it. How come that's stupid? And then I did it once. We went and planted trees, and with my kids were with me. It was a big deal for all those years of, not only did I want to know where my tree was that I've been planting over the years.
But what day was it? What day did you have to water it?
Yeah, and then there's this very wonderful scene in a very early film, Israeli film called Salah Shabati.
Yes.
Salah Shabati is a Yemenite immigrant, and he gets a job with the JNF, and he watches as they come one day, and while he's working, and they come with a big sign that says the Hilda and Solomon Rosenberg Forest, and they plant the sign, and 15 minutes after they plant the sign, a limousine drives up. The people get out of the car, and they see, they're the Rosenbergs. They see the sign. They're very, very proud of the forest that they just donated to. They get in the limousine. They leave. 15 minutes later, they come. They pull out the sign. They got another sign for the Goldbergs. They put the other sign in, and another limousine comes up, and the Goldbergs get out and look at the same forest. That's as early as cynicism. So Tu B'Shvat has become the holiday of
The trees.
Ecology.
that's
Oh,
the holiday of
yeah,
ecology. So it's had quite a history and evolution. The food that was traditionally eaten on Tu B'Shvat was carob, charuv, right? Why carob? Because carob was something that grew in Israel. You could pack it, you could send it all over the world, and people would be able to take it in a little shtetl in Poland or someplace else, and they would say, "This is totzeret haaretz. This grew in Israel," and to eat it. My favorite story is that I'm on my way to Israel. I'm on the plane, and in the back where people are davening, there's a guy that's handing out little pieces of carob because we're landing on Tu B'Shvat. And I'm thinking to myself, here was the idea that someone living in who knows where could, and I'm half an hour out of Tel Aviv, and this guy took carob that he took with him. Now he's handing out to remind us of we're gonna land in a few minutes. So I thought that was one of my favorite Tu B'Shvat stories.
What about a Tu B'Shvat Seder?
And people organize a Tu B'Shvat Seder,
Wonderful.
which now has all kinds of permutations and development in different colored foods and a whole order that people have developed. But all of that is a recent development. Okay, next week, Adam and Eve. See you then.
This is great. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Oh,